fragmented world. And thank you all for joining us. My name is Samuel. I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation. And I work with Civicus, but I am also part of the Insured project, which I can explain briefly before we dive in. So it is a research consortium studying how the EU and its member states can better defend multilateralism and make global governance more robust, effective, and democratic. Its research assesses the state of play in different areas and investigates the EU and other international actors' strengths and weaknesses, with the goal of defending and transforming multilateralism. So as part of this project, we've organized a webinar series which connects the Insured project research with civil society practice. And we're trying to translate these cutting edge research findings into practical strategies and concrete guidance, especially for organizations working to reform global governance in key policy areas. So this is the fourth installment of the series, focusing on global trade governance. So thanks to all for joining us. And to introduce briefly the topic before we get started, the global trading system is currently facing unprecedented challenges from economic nationalism, great power competition, and the inward turn of major economies, which threatens the multilateral foundation of international commerce. The webinar today examines how can trade institutions adapt to these geopolitical realities while addressing persistent inequalities and incorporating social and environmental standards. The discussion also explores pathways for civil society to influence trade governance reform, and that can also hopefully serve developmental goals and democratic values rather than just commercial interests. So today we have a great panel of experts to discuss these issues. So I'm pleased to introduce Clara Weinhardt, who's assistant professor at Maastricht University. She specializes in global trade and its intersection with sustainable development, with a particular focus on global governance and North-South relations. She's also the author of the Insured report on revitalizing and reforming the World Trade Organization in an age of geopolitics, and also the report on expanding the World Trade Organization's scope in a shifting geopolitical landscape, an appraisal of development, environment, and inclusiveness agendas. I'm also pleased to introduce Michal Parizek, who's the Associate Professor and Deputy Head of the Department of International Relations at the Institute of Political Studies at Charles University. He researches and teaches on the subjects of international politics and international organizations. He's also the co-author of the Insured reports on revitalizing and reforming the World Trade Organization and expanding the World Trade Organization's scope in a shifting geopolitical landscape. And then I'm also pleased to introduce Martin Munu, who is doctor at the Faculty of Law at Maastricht University. He's also recently completed his thesis on recent developments at the World Trade Organization titled Designing Development-Oriented International E-Commerce Agreements. And he also has extensive experience of working on and researching economic and trade policies, trade negotiations, regional integration, and investment for sustainable development. So let's now proceed with a brief presentation of these research findings from the Insured Research Report. And just to remind everyone, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available soon on Civicus's YouTube channel and also on the website of the Insured project. So in case you missed something or you'd like to share it with your colleagues, it'll be available. I'm also going to share some relevant links in the chat shortly. So for now, let's get started with the brief presentation. So go ahead, Michal and Clara.
All right, thanks a lot, Samuel. First of all, thanks for having us. This is a great opportunity for us to reach out to civil society audiences and share some insights from our research on the current state of the global trade regime. So I'm going to kick us off with a couple of slides on where the global trade regime is. Let me just verify with you that you actually do see now the front slide. And the kind of the overarching theme we want to talk about for this introductory part with Clara is the revitalization of multilateral trade and the overall context within which we are talking about this topic is what here is referred to as fragmented world. So what do we mean by this specifically in the context of the global trade regime? So you might be familiar with the fact that the World Trade Organization, as sort of the central pillar of the global trade regime, has been with us for quite some time. It has celebrated its 30th birthday last year. But at the same time, the organization has been facing major difficulties, basically, in particular, since the start of the second presidency of the US President Donald Trump. So on the one hand, we have here a very well established and seemingly very powerful international organization that has been discussing the need to reform its own working and to make itself fit for purpose, so to say, for 21st century global economy for many years. In fact, for 15 years at least, there's been a serious debate on the need to reform the World Trade Organization, and we can come into the details of that later on. But on the other hand, since early last year, we've been living in a world in which it seems no rules apply, really, at least to trade policies adopted by the United States as originally kind of one of the principal sponsors of the global trade regime and of the World Trade Organization itself. So we really have a big tension here, where on the one hand, there is an ongoing ongoing reform agenda into which many countries, many members have invested heavily, including the United States, for sure, over the years. But on the other hand, we have sort of major disruption into the operation of the global trade regime. So we are situating our debate and our report, our findings within this context. And more urgently at this stage, we are talking a couple of days before the start, or a week or so before the start of the 14th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, which is going to take place in Yaoundé from March 26. So this is something that gives our discussion here additional urgency at this stage. Now, let me just very briefly highlight some of the key issues that have been discussed in the WTO context in the sort of long-term reform agenda, that has been going on for years. So the World Trade Organization has been known for years for having what many other international organizations were envious of, and it's a very strong dispute settlement mechanism, so a very strong, powerful court that is able to enforce agreed upon rules. Now, this court has been effectively blocked since 2017, or more specifically since 2019, by the US, who have been able to prevent appointments of new judges of its appellate body. So that's one area where major reform discussions have been ongoing over the last couple of years. And these discussions should have delivered concrete results, concrete solutions to the kind of blocked, to the blockage of this dispute settlement mechanism, of this sort of court of the world trade, by the end of 2024, which hasn't happened. And of course, since the Trump election, it has become obvious that this is not going to happen. So this is one area, right, where we have seen a lot of effort, but at the same time, no real results before the presidential elections in the US, and then all the more clearly not happening in 2025 and not seem likely to happen in 2026. The second area is the persistent inability of the organization to come up with new rules. Right? So if we look at it kind of critically, current rulebook in the World Trade Organization mostly comes from 1995, 1994, from the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization, which is the end of the so-called Uruguay round of trade negotiations talks, which started in 1984. So the agenda of these negotiations has been set in 1984. So the rules have obviously become obsolete to some extent in many regards, given the dramatic changes in technology, but also given the dramatic political changes in the kind of broader political economic context of world trade. So this is another area where basically, because the organization operates on a consensus principle, so any country can prevent the membership from moving forward on a particular agenda. There have been very little in terms of negotiated outcomes over the almost by now more than 30 years of WTO's existence. So this is the second area. And the third, which we have focused on, is what we call new sensitive agendas, which are primarily connected with two areas that have come to be they've come to the center of geopolitical and geoeconomic contests recently. One is obviously security itself, so-called security exception in the WTO rulebook. So under what conditions can a member claim that something, let's say, trade in a particular good, let's say in steel or in some other food, is a matter of national security and therefore is effectively exempt from the rules that apply to everything else. So this is one issue. And the second is industrial policy and subsidies, which is mostly connected with China. And I'm very happy to delve into that deeper in the Q&A if there is an interest in that. But broadly, these are the three agendas that we are covering in the report, where we discuss where there is the most urgent need for the World Trade Organization and the global trade regime to reform. Now, I'm going to pass the floor to Clara to continue with the discussion of where we are right now.
Thanks a lot, Michal, and thanks also from my side to Samuel for hosting us. So while these reform processes have been going on for a while, we did see in the last year and until now quite a shift in the global trade regime that happened after Trump was re-elected as president of the United States. There was the so-called reciprocal tariff shock with the US unilaterally imposing very high tariffs on almost all countries of the world, which led to the perception of the whole system crumbling suddenly, because none of this was in line with the rules set on the WTO. And of course, this hasn't helped to push the ongoing reform processes to a successful conclusion. Rather to the contrary, there have been fears. I remember at the time when Trump was re-elected, there were questions like, will the WTO survive? I mean, we've seen this at the WTO survive, but we've also seen quite a shift in terms of a really protectionist turn and really openly undermining WTO rules coming from the US. In response of that, there has been a bit of a pushback and an attempt to say, like, let's revive these reform debates, because really we see the system is under threat. And if we don't have it, we will have these unilateral tariffs being imposed. And that's not actually what most countries in the world want. So there was a new reform facilitator, an ambassador from Norway that has been appointed in guiding a new reform process and pushing for making these things happen, including at the upcoming ministerial conference. But the thing is, what the US asked for is quite a fundamental rebalancing and an adjustment of how the system works at the moment. So this is even beyond what has been on the table. So while the US remains a member of the WTO, this turn in the position, which kind of was not a U-turn, because a lot of the US criticisms have been there for many, many years, including under Democratic presidencies. But of course, this Trump shock has made the reform efforts much more complicated. Next slide, please. So we've seen there are a lot of tensions ahead of the ministerial conference. The EU tabled a new reform proposal in January, and in some of the positions of what the EU is demanding, it is perceived to be actually quite in line with the US positions, and in particular in asking for reflections on the role of the so-called most favored nation principle in the WTO, which is a principle that says if you lower your tariffs vis-a-vis one country, you have to extend this to all countries and you can't discriminate against them, which kind of ensures a bit of a level playing field, but also protects against a rise of tariffs. And this is something that's, of course, not in line with the US policy of unilaterally raising tariffs in different ways across different members of the World Trade Organization. And the EU now openly also called for, let's reflect on this principle and whether or not this is the best principle for the World Trade Organization in the current moment of time. We have seen China also made a submission subsequently, defending the existing system and presenting itself as the champion of trade multilateralism. So there are a lot of tensions ahead of the upcoming ministerial conference. But next slide, please. Overall, the likelihood of achieving such a fundamental WTO reform remains really, really low. And this is because on the one hand, there's a strong dependence on what the US wants, and the US doesn't want the current WTO system to function again. But we also have to think about this actually predates Trump too. So there have been long-standing disagreements amongst all major actors, including not only the US, China, Europe, India also playing a particular role in the WTO context. So there really is a very entrenched level of disagreement amongst major powers of what the WTO should be doing and how the rules should be rewritten, which of course makes it tremendously difficult to achieve a WTO reform, especially given there is reliance on the consensus decision-making principle. And before this upcoming ministerial conference, these conflicts haven't become easier to resolve, which next slide leaves us a little bit with a question, okay, what should WTO members do? And I think, of course, there's not one answer that fits all members, because we've seen already that they disagree on what should be done. But if you remember that in general things, it's better to have trade ruled by multilateral rules rather than the system where the more powerful countries can dictate whatever tariffs they want to impose on others, regardless of WTO rules. There are a number of scenarios, right? One could be to say like, okay, if nothing is moving with WTO rules, we should focus efforts elsewhere. This could be regional trade or bilateral trade agreements and just renegotiate rules elsewhere. Another option would be to say, well, we do need to focus on the WTO, but let's rather push for piecemeal reforms that keep the WTO somewhat more functional than it is at the moment. Or lastly, to say like, well, if this needs to work, we really need to go for the fundamental renewal and rewrite the WTO rules. From the European perspective, what comes out of the research we've been doing is that a somewhat dual strategy is likely to work best. Don't disabandon the WTO completely, preserve its functionality, including through piecemeal reforms, but really also build a coalition for rules-based trade elsewhere. I think this is our last slide. I only want to highlight we focused on the WTO reform now, but next slide, there's one more slide, but just with to show that we've written another report that looks more at the inclusion of development, environment, and the inclusiveness agendas in the WTO. So if you're interested in that, that's also available on our project webpage, and we're happy to address questions on this in the Q&A as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Micha and Clara, for that presentation. Gives us a great idea of the fantastic research you've done already on this subject. And I think we should just dive straight into some of these questions on the issues at hand that are especially facing the global trade regime. So let's start with some questions on institutional resilience and geopolitical fragmentation. I think one of the main things that you brought up was the fact that geopolitical rivalries, particularly between the US and China, but also between other great powers, are straining the multilateral system, especially a trading system. And so I wanted to ask you, Clara, firstly, how real is the risk that the World Trade Organization becomes unfit for purpose? And what reforms do you think are most urgently needed?
I think it's a tricky question in the sense that it depends on how do you define unfit for purpose, right? I don't think we see the WTO going away. We've seen, despite all the criticism that the US has had of the WTO, they've been willing to remain a member and pay the membership fees. And around 70% of world trade is still being administered by WTO rules. But we do see that number has actually decreased by quite a bit, especially in the last year. And if this trend is continuing, in a way, the WTO will become less and less fit of doing its job of administering global trade rules. And I think if we think about this shift away from the WTO, there are two possibilities. One, members can shift outside of the WTO, but do WTO consistent stuff, or even go and negotiate so-called WTO plus rules that are within the spirit of WTO multilateralism, or they can go outside of the WTO to regulate trade in ways that is really power-based and different than what the US has been doing in the past year. And I think if we see more and more countries following the US example, then that's way more threatening also to the WTO of doing its job. And what reforms are needed, I mean, I think Michal listed the really essential ones, and there needs to be a functioning dispute settlement system, and there needs to be a way to achieve negotiations and conclude negotiations to set new rules and to allow members to do that within the WTO rather than having to go outside. I think these two areas are really key.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so thanks for the reform aspect especially. And well, I want to ask you, Micha, as well, what given the fact that there are some paralyzed elements, especially the appellate body, for example, what structural weaknesses do you think make the WTO most vulnerable, and how could these be addressed, perhaps with directed reform efforts?
This is a great question. I think it's difficult to, I mean, it's relatively straightforward to do the diagnosis of where the problems are. It's much more difficult to figure out the cure for that. So I think the diagnosis is that for any governance system, you need a body that is able to create rules that are relevant for the stuff that is supposed to be governed. So if you have economy that is rushing ahead, you know, with globalization unthought of in 1980s or even 1990s, that is driven by technological change, and that is based on global value change, you know, kind of things not really envisaged, let's say in mid-1980s or even mid-1990s, to be so prominent as they are today. You need a body that is going to create rules that make sense for this economic reality. Right? Then you need a system or a mechanism that adjudicates disputes, which is really the court. I mean, so when they're trading partners, and some partners' rights are violated, or that partner, the agent needs to be able to seek remedy, and that remedy shouldn't be necessarily a kind of retributive. It should just be based on some kind of legal mechanism where there is an independent judge to decide on whether harm has been done and what's the punishment, or how to compensate for that. So I think this is the two, really creating new rules and re-establishing adjudication body, so a court, effectively. I think you ask about structural issues. I think there are two that go beyond this sort of usual discussion of these two major problems. One issue is that we really are in a deeply geopoliticized context. So that means what used to be an organization mostly caring about commerce, about commercial interests of states, has much more become an organization that somehow has to deal with the fact that some members, and the US is a very prominent example, but others are following suit, that they consider trade to be part of a much broader foreign policy toolkit, and suddenly things that normally would be about, sort of win-win cooperation are perceived as a sort of zero-sum interaction, and that's not helping. So, and especially in a context in which some countries are trying to use the leverage, their power, to push their own economic interest quite openly at the expense of the others. Of course, this zero-sum game dynamic, they're messing things up. So this is one structural weakness of the system. And then second, it's perhaps a little more subtle, but maybe relevant for the sort of platform that we are discussing this at today, is the fact that WTO indeed hasn't delivered much for essentially 30 years, or since the attempts at this negotiation started in 2001. So we have a quarter a century, right? So, if you think in terms of engagement of civil society, of businesses, we may come back to that later on as well. What's the sort of incentive for these actors to take active part in these political processes, to lobby in good or bad way their own governments, to go to Geneva? What's the incentive to do that? If you haven't seen any results, any outcomes in 25 years, do you expect them to come now? I mean, it's quite unlikely that this is going to happen. So there is a sort of a vicious cycle here, I would almost say, where the engagement from bottom, might be lower than would be ideal for this sort of area, which otherwise normally you would have expected should receive a lot of engagement from civil society and businesses in particular. So this is maybe something we may want to address further on, but I wanted to highlight it since you asked about structural weaknesses.
Thanks a lot for highlighting these issues, Mika. And yeah, we can come back to some of those later on as well. So I wanted to bring you in as well, Martin, and I'll ask about your experience of working directly alongside trade negotiations in East Africa. And how do you think this geopolitical confrontation that we're seeing between major powers is playing out from an East African perspective, and how could East African countries navigate regional integration and World Trade Organization commitments?
Well, thank you very much, Samuel. I like the research. I think these findings are really key, and if we could also widen the dissemination, it would be something that is so useful to the different actors engaged in the WTO. From my standpoint, I see this geopolitical rivalry as something that is really reinforcing existing unbalanced nature of relationships between countries, which to a great extent has really undermined the development objectives of African countries. But the starting point for these countries is we have their main interest, which is to develop their economies, uplift their people from poverty, and they have put industrialization as key towards ensuring that they are effectively integrated in the global value chain in a meaningful way. Here, I mean in a way that can translate their engagement in trade to increasing the standard of living, increasing employment, and facilitating their productive capacity to rise to a level that can enable them to compete. So African countries have this as really their main development objectives. But now with this geopolitical competition, it brings two different elements that needs to be discussed. One is the positive one, which is it offers an opportunity for these countries to negotiate better terms. For instance, when you look at the access to their resources, the critical minerals, you now have different actors that are willing to come and engage these countries to negotiate. And many of these African countries have these resources. For instance, if you look at the Congo. But the challenge there is traditionally, resource-rich countries have had this what we call the natural resource curse. And so when you look at from the oil, from oil to minerals and the like, they have really not substantially transformed the livelihoods of communities of host countries, except for a few countries like Botswana that have managed to get a good international agreements with effective governance frameworks. But to take advantage of these opportunities in terms of negotiations, there is need to promote a transparency in the process, and this is something that we are really not saying, because a lot of the negotiations and the agreements happen in closed doors. We just find from media reports that this country has made an agreement with it, or the EU is or the US is negotiating or has already a deal with country XY to access these critical minerals, or different actors like the EU and the US have made these strategies and they want to access these critical minerals. So that opportunity of negotiating better trade terms is challenged by those traditionally unbalanced relationships. But we have a negative, secondly, it's really a negative effect on this. The WTO, with all the challenges that we have, that many activists or even researchers presented in terms of not fully accommodating the needs of developing countries, there's the WTO allows for some bit of market access under the WTO rules. For instance, the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, that the US extended duty-free, quota-free market access to African countries. And even through the partnership agreement between the EU and African countries, from Lome to Cotonou, we've had this duty-free, quota-free market access in terms of everything but arms. So this market access is now challenged because, for instance, when you look at the US and the tariffs that have been put in place, export-dependent African countries are first challenges with these increased tariffs. So this is something that I see it as undermining the market access for these countries, and which has a ripple effect in terms of employment, in terms of securing foreign exchange, and also in terms of that proper integration into the global value chain. So how to navigate this? I think there is need to continue engaging at the multilateral level, because the multilateral level offers a forum where African countries can unite with other like-minded or countries that have similar levels of development, for instance, the LDC group, and they have a stronger negotiating voice. And because of the consensus-based decision-making process in the WTO, it means even these small African countries or the countries in East Africa can still have a voice. And when being backed by other countries, they have that strong negotiating voice that enables them to at least get some consensus from developed country members. But as African countries navigate this process through promoting multilateralism, there is also need to recognize that multilateralism has been fractured, and the geopolitical rivalry doesn't make it any easier. And so what we are seeing now is the rise in bilateral agreements, and even what now we just call deals. For instance, what the US is doing recently, they have had a lot of agreements with a number of African countries to promote cooperation in the health sector. And there was the issue of data that also became key, data transfer, that some have raised concerns on it. So there is need for East African countries to get ready for this bilateral. And they can only get ready by pushing for regional integration to try and avoid a scenario where developed country members, whether it is the US or the EU, and even increasingly China, engage at the bilateral level with a country. So if East African countries, for instance, we have a common market, so that means any negotiation should ideally be handled at that regional level. And this also kind of diffuses the negotiating capacity that is very much would be very much reduced when these countries engage at the bilateral level with the development partners, whether it's with third parties, I could say. So regional integration in this sense, I see that African countries need to push for it. We've seen already a lot, for instance, in the EAC, but even at the continental level. And this is probably even more important beyond the EAC because of the increasing nature of the need to increase intra-African trade. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that has been agreed. And so if African countries can push this regional integration agenda and reach a level of some bit of agreed common external tariffs on how these parties are supposed to treat products originating from third parties, then it would be easier, for them to engage with the powers in a footing that can allow them to, one, protect their resources, but can also allow them to implement other trade policy tools that can facilitate their employment creation and ensure that or facilitate a trade relationship that ensures that their resources are used in a way that is more mutually beneficial to all the trading parties.
Thanks very much, Martin, for the comprehensive answer. And I think you've highlighted some really interesting issues around the dangers that and threats that countries, especially in the global south, are facing, but also the benefits of multilateralism and also a lot of other key subjects that we want to talk a bit further about now, I think. So we're going to try and talk a bit about the issues of development and sustainability and democratic legitimacy. So I wanted to turn the conversation towards you, Clara, now, and ask you how the WTO is dealing with pressure to address new issues, and how should trade institutions incorporate environmental and developmental agendas without one crowding out the other, as these are competing at times.
Thanks a lot, Samuel. It's a very important question to think about the linkages between these different agendas that are added on to the traditional trade agenda. And you brought up development and environment. And it is true that a lot of times they are presented as being in conflict with each other. And what quite a number of WTO members complain about is that regulation on the environment or sustainability related standards of saying you can only trade if you're complying with certain levels of sustainability can be seen as green protectionism, right? And this undermines the ability of countries to push forward with economic development. But I must say that for the research we've done for the second insured report, we also found that there is not a uniform developing country member position on these newer issues and how they should be included in the World Trade Organization. While some, notably, for instance, India, are completely against addressing those issues in the multilateral realm, others, most notably countries from Latin America, are very much at the forefront of newer formats and new ideas of pushing the trade environment nexus and including this in WTO conversations. So to me, I think it also depends on how these issues become linked exactly and making sure there is enough flexibility to acknowledge development-related concerns that some members may be having. And here, the devil is often in the detail. So what doesn't work so well, I would say, is developed country members dictating the terms of how this nexus should be integrated in the WTO. What works much better is developing country members taking the lead in thinking along and making proposals and also having a bit more flexibility. And with trade, it often gets technical. But one thing that is important at this nexus area is, for instance, if you have certain sustainability standards linked to trade, you do have to show you comply with them, right? And here something called mutual recognition of equivalence matters. It's very technical, but it matters if you are exporting from Paraguay, you can say, we've done the sustainability assessment in the way we do it in Paraguay, and this is the certificate. And then you have, for instance, the European Union, where the good is supposed to be exported, saying, like, we recognize this as equivalent, right? And I think this is a way that allows for a little bit of leeway and flexibility that is accommodating and works to make sure that environment and development are not crowding out each other, because otherwise you may get in a situation where there are very tedious requirements for showing the compliance with certain environmental standards. That's a very costly procedure that some participants in the supply chain may not be able to prove, and hence they are excluded from the trade. So I think there are also ways in which you can link the two. So you ensure they don't necessarily inherently have to be one against the other, because we do see a lot of developing country members are actually pushing for regulation on sustainability or have new ideas about how to walk this line of trade and sustainability.
Very much. Yeah, this is interesting. And I also wanted to ask you, Michal, about the element of participation and democratic participation, because these trade negotiations are often very opaque. And I was wondering what practical mechanisms could maybe open up trade governments to greater democratic participation, particularly from civil society organizations?
Thanks. Yeah, I think so. From a sort of political science perspective, but also from very practical perspective, there are always two sides to this. One is that participation goes via your national representation. The other one is direct participation, right? So I think in terms of the national leg, I think this is something that is happening with varying degree in different countries, in different contexts, right? The extent to which actually civil society or businesses are able to take part in actually shaping the national positions for these negotiations, it obviously varies. I mean, it also varies over time a lot. I mean, know that late 1990s, early 2000s, I mean, in these days, there was a massive interest from civil society as well as from businesses in global economic governance at large and World Trade Organization as well, not necessarily in a positive way, right? This was often very critical engagement with the agenda. I think this has gone down. So I think in general, the easiest path for a nationally situated civil society organization is to want to speak to its trade negotiators, to want to speak to its ministries. And I'm not sure to what extent this is still happening. I hear that this may actually be happening a little bit more even than maybe with businesses. As I already mentioned that the disengagement may be a serious issue, right? Because who is pushing for the states to actually engage seriously, to invest political capital into negotiations, right? If it's not civil society or businesses, right? I mean, the staff of the ministries will have some interest in doing that, but if there is a political pressure, that obviously helps or facilitates this engagement. So anyway, this is the national leg, which of course varies from country to country. Now there is the WTO leg as well. So there are direct mechanisms through which, for example, civil society actors can make like formal submissions into processes. Of course, then you can ask about the extent to which these are going to be taken into account. If they are just randomly coming in at some point in time. But there are mechanisms for more structured discussion. So there is the WTO has the public forum. So this is something. This is like a yearly gathering where people from outside of governments and the WTO itself are meeting in Geneva, which obviously also has some costs, for participants from outside of Europe. So this is an obstacle. But there is this direct mechanism. There is also the Civil Society Advisory Board, which I understand the current Director General has actually established like 2 years ago. The Civil Society Advisory Group, not board, which is meant to precisely kind of trigger and motivate civil society members to take more active part in the WTO's dealings. Because I also do think that actually the WTO and members have been recognizes this shortage of input, kind of bottom-up input, whether from businesses or from civil society, as an issue, right? I mean, I guess after the 2000s, when there were these massive protests, the Battle of Seattle in '99 and so on, I think everybody in WTO context might have been like very relaxed when they figured out that actually civil society has become less interested in global trade. But I think these times are gone as well. I think the understanding that you need to continuously engage civil society as well as businesses, of course, is there. It's just that because the WTO hasn't been really delivering concrete, big high stakes agreements, this interest might have gone down. So I think this is also something to consider, for those interested in world trade, to simply make use of these opportunities which the WTO has been putting out. Now, one thing that might be of interest could be also training, which is something that already has been touched on a little bit, but I think there is also recognition that trade can get very technical at points, whether on legal side or on economic side. So actually, WTO has also been trying to, open up in the sense of providing free training or online courses or this sort of stuff for people who are interested in that agenda, so that they can more effectively take part in the discussions. Because obviously, capacity, not only in terms of the number of people's hours that can take part in some debate, but also in terms of ability to get into the complexities of the matters that are discussed, is at some point, at some level, it becomes important for effective rather than just formal participation. So I'm not sure if this really addresses well your question, but this is probably the best I can provide.
Thanks very much. No, it's great. And it's also great to hear about new opportunities and initiatives for civil society access, which I think is really crucial and across global governance. But also wanted to turn to you, Martin, about other issues that are recently coming up at the WTO. So your research has looked a lot at e-commerce negotiations and their implications for micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. And WTO members are pushing for agreements in this area. So what do you think the benefits and risks would be for smaller businesses, especially in countries that haven't crossed the digital divide?
Well, thank you. I mean, this is really an interesting area that I've been looking at for some time now. The e-commerce agreement at the WTO is something that members have been pushing for some time now, but there was also a pushback on to an agreement, especially from around 2019 there, when the EU and some group of countries were made proposals to literally start negotiations for an agreement under the WTO 1998 work program on e-commerce. But there was no consensus on that. And so interested members then started the initiative called the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce to have a plurilateral agreement. So this is a kind of a subset of an agreement among WTO members of only willing members. And they wanted the benefits to only be to the members, but also then it should not also hurt non-members. The negotiations have touched many issues, and now there is an agreement called the stabilized text, of which some members have also not formally accepted them. They decided not to be a part of it. But in broad sense, an agreement of this nature would facilitate market access for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and link these enterprises to export to the markets of their export interests. Of course, this is something that many companies in countries with low levels of digital capacity have always struggled with. It's not only an e-commerce issue, but an overall trade issue. So, for instance, if there is proper mutual recognition of e-signature, some quick issues, some quick parts of the agreement that can easily be implemented, or electronic authentication, for instance, that has also been agreed. It can make it easier for MSMEs to export. But of course, this depends on them meeting the standards, which I'll mention in a while. But secondly, there is also the opportunity for them to close the digital divide, because this agreement has some elements of cooperation to facilitate development, although it is really not having legally binding wording, but it still shows the commitment of members that they are willing to cooperate and discuss these issues to build capacity, close the digital divide. So this is something that, if it is taken forward, for instance, if members enter more into the negotiation and they're able to come up with an agreement that make it legally enforceable, then it can achieve that objective. There's also the issue of attracting investment in the digital economy. Closing the digital divide requires huge amounts of investment in both the internet, the digital ecosystem. And this is something that if the agreement can allow your countries to have policies that can facilitate this investment, and also open up markets for foreign investment to flow in this area, but the kind of foreign investment that meets the development objectives of these countries, not only extractive-based kind of investment, but really production-inducing investment for transforming the digital economy. There is also the issue of promoting policy space for other non-trade objectives. for instance, data protection, promoting cybersecurity, which and consumer protection, which in broad sense all facilitates trade. But even for MSMEs that are less trusted, if they are trading online, and there is that higher level of assurance for consumers that even MSMEs that would traditionally not be trusted, but since they're trading on online platforms that guarantee this data protection and consumer protection, then they are also given a chance to export. I would also talk about the overall issue of liberalization, especially the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. This kind of has both positive and negative implications. In the positive elements, it promotes really this trade in electronic transmission, but there it also presents potential revenue losses. And this is something that we need to contend with, because digitalization will only increase trade for products that were originally traded in their tangible forms. Good examples have always been given of for ebooks or streaming of music from DVDs now to online platforms. Now, in terms of revenues, developing countries have very much traditionally relied on tariffs, because it is easy to administer, and it also has that industrial policy objective, for them. But now with digitalization, then they lose that, because this once these products are now transmitted digitally, then they can no longer tax it. So there is that element of revenue losses. There's been an argument that maybe value-added tax could be applied in to substitute that. Of course, that increases, that addresses that element, promotes that revenue, additional revenue from the digital, from the extension of digital trade. But the industrial protection, the industrial policy tool is kind of a bit lost. But this now depends on what countries really want, because some countries, even the MSMEs in these countries, also would very much want to be able to reduce costs as they move electronic transmissions. So it is both a two-way issue. A lot of the discussion has been on the revenue element, but the needs of the MSMEs, that revenue, if it is linked towards promoting the productive capacity of MSMEs, then it would be something that very much would be very much welcome. But there is also the issue of competition, increased competition, even in the domestic market. That this agreement, then that brings. I mean, if it is something that is realized. For instance, we have seen even in the EU, there is flooding of European markets with cheap Chinese products. We've seen the EU coming up with legislation to protect consumers, to promote the quality of this product. When you look at Temu, for instance, Shein, a lot of cases that has reached the EU to try and protect the European consumers. But now in countries with low levels of digital capacity, they don't have strong regulations like in the EU. And so protecting their consumers on one side from this product, it would be difficult. But also importantly, the protection of their domestic businesses. Because a lot of these businesses could even import those products from China, but then they are able to at least get some value from it, and part of the value then remains within the local economy. But now with e-commerce, then it's easier for consumers to really cut that business element from importation and just ship those products. And we know the issue of economies of scale. Then the domestic businesses, whether sellers themselves, but also producers of substitutes that would be acquired online, then they have that increased competition, which threatens not only their business survival, but also the overall issue of building industries within these countries. Lastly, there is the challenge of these countries in Africa with low levels of digital capacity, meeting the export requirements. Because on one side, you can have market access, but entering that market requires you to meet some standards. Yeah, for instance, meeting the high standards of exporting to the EU, the safety of the products, the increasing roles, for instance, on sustainability, the issue of labor standards to meet them. This is something that MSMEs would struggle really to meet. So even though the agreement would provide that market access, but meeting the conditions that you need to meeting those conditions to access those markets becomes challenging. There is also the issue of opening accounts and having addresses in your export markets. So this is something that MSMEs from this group of countries would struggle to meet. So all in all, I see this really having that e-commerce agreement and the issue of addressing the digital divide has something that could be like a work in progress. Because even what we have tabled right now as the stabilized text has some issues that were very much of interest of other countries. For instance, data localization that has been kind of removed. And so this agreement is more of a digital economy facilitation agreement. And so this is something that I think members will still need to look at more. And this is why also we are seeing a lot of the agreements again being pushed at the bilateral level. And so still the African countries will then need to still look at this issue of multilateralism versus bilateralism. Because it is because of at that multilateral level at the WTO, it is the reason why the JSI, the Joint Settlement Initiative, stabilized tax could be seen as more development friendly than the earlier proposals that we had. Also, if you also compare them with other regional trade agreements, for instance, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the US MCA. So the multilateral element, I would still really bring it as really an important route through which we can have some agreement that can promote a framework that facilitates closing the digital divide and facilitate international cooperation, transfer of technology, and technical assistance, basically, and capacity building for African countries.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your points on this new area, which is obviously of growing importance, the e-commerce debate, the World Trade Organization, but also it was interesting to hear your points about multilateralism versus bilateralism and perspective from East African countries also. And that brings us smoothly into the next section, which is about EU leadership and civil society strategies going forward. And so I was thinking, I was going to ask you, Clara, about how the EU can credibly champion multilateral trade reform and even though it's deploying its own unilateral trade instruments, what would genuine EU leadership look like?
Thanks a lot for the question. And first, let me maybe focus specifically on unilateral instruments at the trade environment nexus that we discussed before. And this is because some of these more recent instruments have really been at the forefront of discussions, including in the World Trade Organization. So there is this link of, is this undermining or supporting world trade rules, and what's the EU doing and pushing ahead? And two of these instruments that are particularly prominent is first CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and secondly EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation. So the first one, CBAM, says if you're producing certain limited goods, for instance, cement, and you're emitting carbon, but you don't have to pay a price in your country for doing that to become more sustainable, the EU asks you to pay that tax at the border when you export the good to the EU, saying, well, our companies have to comply with certain standards on CO2 emissions, so we want to create a level playing field. So this is the CBAM mechanism. The EUDR says if the way in which you produce certain goods lead to certain levels of deforestation, and in the extreme case, we don't even want your product. So it's kind of a ban, right? So it's not that you pay something additional, But then really there's a saying, well, we're not allowing deforestation anymore in Europe, so we also don't want to let the problem occur elsewhere, and we're just importing the products. They've been highly contested in the World Trade Organization. And I think to be more credible as a champion of multilateralism, the EU needs to do at least three things. The first one, of course, at a very basic level, is to show that these new unilateral instruments are compatible with existing rules of the WTO. The EU is very confident that CBAM is compatible with the WTO rules, and so far it hasn't been actively challenged. With the EU deforestation regulation, I think there's still a bit of a question mark. This regulation has become so contested that the EU has time and time again delayed the implementation of the instrument. So the implementation phase hasn't started yet, but there are some that are wondering whether or not the way in which it's designed is actually in line with trade multilateralism. And of course, this is something the EU needs to make sure if it wants to also promote trade multilateralism, to make sure whenever the EU says we are going ahead because we want to push and move quicker than the 160 plus members that are not agreeing on this, to make sure you design trade instruments in a way that are compatible with existing rules. Secondly, I do think there is also this question of the devil's in the detail and how exactly are they designed, and is that in the spirit of trade multilateralism, right? So this is less about compatibility, but this idea also with multilateralism of having reciprocal relations, but also cooperating together, right? Rather than one side setting the rules that everybody else is supposed to comply with. And here, especially with the EU deforestation regulation, a lot of observers have been critical of some of the ways in which it's designed, including that the EU has created certain risk categories and says the EU is deciding whether the countries are high risk or low risk or no risk in terms of deforestation. And I think that is an approach that doesn't fit so well with the spirit of multilateralism, or let's say a multipolar world, saying the EU is walking around and putting countries in specific risk categories. For a long time, it wasn't quite clear how that methodology is going to look like. So there has been a lot of contestation. We've seen now that very few countries are actually seen to be in the risk category. But yeah, there are questions about the kind of design and how you go ahead, and is it a good idea to put countries into boxes when you have this unilateral legislation. And the third point, I would argue, is it's of course not a bad idea to move ahead with legislation you think that's important, right? And there are sound motives for pushing forward on legislation that links to the trade and sustainability nexus. But for me, a real leadership from the European side needs to go beyond being compatible with WTO law and kind of being sensible in design. But to be a leader, you also need followers, right? And this goes in the direction of really taking the concerns of the partner countries into consideration, which the EU has done post hoc. So they've moved ahead with the legislation, the proposals, and then later on they realized, oh, let's actually consult other countries. And the EU has delayed the implementation, for instance, of EUDR. But I think if you do this from the outset in a different way, you may get a very different reception. And what we've seen that especially with the deforestation regulation, this hasn't been a way for the EU to make friends, right? There has been a lot of pushback, a lot of reception that this is not the way it's supposed to be done, and this is not in the spirit of multilateralism. So I think while on substance, some of these legislation may be a good idea, there's really needs to be a consideration of what's in it and how, also the process of how are you advancing it, when are you introducing it, and to what extent can you show flexibility and really team up with others as you seek to develop this new legislation. So this is something I would advise the EU to pay more attention to moving forward with unilateral legislation.
Thanks very much. Yeah, the spirit of multilateralism is interesting to bring up, and I think that's an important point about how the EU should move forward in global governance. I wanted to also talk a bit about civil society and how it can in participate, perhaps. And so, Martin, I was going to turn to you again and thinking about how civil society, especially from the global south, could have the most traction. Would it be in Geneva, in regional forums, or somewhere else, do you think?
Well, I think civil society impact has traditionally been really in Geneva and the associated ministerial conferences, which is held every 2 years in different countries. This is where I see, like already we also mentioned the Battle of Seattle, that Michael talked about. So the civil society, I see their role has been strong there because they have been able to build alliances, and networks across different countries. What is important to note is that the civil society in African countries are also very much constrained, in terms of finances, first to finance their participation in these conferences in Geneva, but their international alliances at least helps that because the governments only are also constrained, and their respective governments even send few negotiators because of these financial constraints. So the alliances have been able to help civil societies to mobilize so that they have different countries represented, and so the diversity there also facilitates engagement in a way that is more accommodative or reflects all the different development interests of these groups of countries. But it is also important to recognize that, much also now seems to be happening, outside outside of the WTO, and this is something that civil societies also have to contend with. Over the last many, could say 20 or so years, we have a huge set of resources or research that has been done, and so civil society have also built their capacity a lot on the various elements of the WTO, especially from the Doha Development Agenda and the development promise, that we have. This is something that the civil society at the start really were very much opposed to it. They saw it as launching a new run without addressing their development interests. But again, when you look at what has happened over the last 10 years or so, I think there is a recognition that the Doha development agenda really needs to be pushed forward because the alternative could easily be worse for these groups of countries. And the collaboration or the international cooperation that the Doha development agenda at least a promise, and which we also see in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is something that the civil society can build around to create impact. But with these changes, we are seeing of a lot happening of the WTO. We are seeing the rise in bilateral agreements. Now, incidentally, we are even calling them deals, to borrow the word from from the US, which is usually only has agreement on key specific issues with a commitment to negotiate other broader issues, almost in isolation of events at the WTO or what is happening in Geneva. And even in some instances, we're also seeing countries that already have a common position in Geneva on these issues still going ahead bilaterally to negotiate these issues. And this, of course, reflects the diverse development interest, but it also reflects the pragmatism that these countries are also seeing because of the changes. So I see traction as moving in two ways. If the civil society can strengthen their regional engagement, their cooperation, collaboration, international collaboration in a way that strengthens their regional engagement. Because for instance, at the East African Community Secretariat, also the AFCFTA Secretariat, and also also in Addis, the AU headquarters, there are also frameworks for civil society engagement, and those frameworks already provide avenues for the civil societies to present their case, or to present their alternative proposals, but also to just tap in their negotiators. So I see also the need to really strengthen collaboration at that level. But probably also very important is the need to look at the domestic level, because in many instances we see a lot of focus on the external elements of trade policy, of trade negotiation, and yet actual implementation, and also a lot of reforms that have really consequences for their development interests, consequences on environmental protection, or the protection of workers' rights, or host community rights. We see a lot of those decisions, or negotiations even happening at a lot of reforms happening at national level to effect what has been agreed either bilaterally with third parties, or even by companies. And so I see incrementally the civil society needs to do that engagement also at the domestic level. Where I see as really traction is really difficult issue, because these issues are all interlinked, and the timing is really a determining factor there. You could say we can gain more traction in Geneva, or in the WTO process, when at that particular a moment we are having, for instance, negotiations, or the resurgence of EU or EAC, or African countries economic partnership agreements that they're having with the EU. Or we are seeing the resurgence of the role or the interest of the US coming back more pronounced in access of critical minerals and the energy transition. So traction would be best gained by looking at the moments, and so that requires being prepared at all levels. For instance, right now we are preparing for Yaoundé, and there are different proposals that countries have in place. So these proposals, maybe we will talk at them later, require the civil society to maintain that focus really at the multilateral level, because of the timing. So timing is key for any civil society action. But, and this is what I would mention really lastly, I would really like to see more engagement also between the civil society and the private and the private sector, because on many instances the private sector has more kind of, the governments tend to give them more leeway, to give their concerns, and also a lot of the international engagements already looks at this private sector. For instance, they need to promote investments, or to promote ease of doing a business, the issue of financial transfer. And so civil society needs to engage not only their governments, but also the private sector. Of course, the interests really diverge a lot in many areas, but they also converge in key areas, especially of promoting the development of domestic economies, because this is something that would also benefit the private sector. The issue of facilitating sustainable development practices, and how different collaborations can be made to secure, for instance, funding for this transition, but also to secure market access. So the areas of convergence with the private sector needs to be also pushed more by the civil society, looking at specifically the time element for engagement.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting that you mentioned the need for more collaboration with from between civil society and the private sector, between civil society and states. And so thanks for that. And also for mentioning Yaoundé, because I was also going to ask you, Michael, about the WTO's 14th Ministerial Conference coming up in Yaoundé on 26th of March. What do you think are the key issues at stake here, and what should civil society prioritize potentially?
I think this is really difficult to say in that I mean the name of the game for the conference is supposed to be reform. So this conference is supposed to be somewhat less about substantive specific agreements and much more about kind of fundamental rethinking of where the WTO is heading, or under what conditions, and how it can kind of survive and maybe grow kind of stronger out of the crisis it is in. So in some sense, I think the institutional side, which is kind of less immediately, relevant to specific agendas that maybe civil society actors might be interested in, is the prominent thing. And I would still probably highlight that. I would very much I would want to tie into what Martin has mentioned also in connection to bilateral, multilateral, and within which platform do members, especially smaller, weaker members, have actually a bigger say, right? I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, in the multilateral regime, if the regime operates, then you have some say, you have some way how to have your interests heard. Otherwise, in bilateral relations or in smaller formats, you're at the mercy of the more powerful counterpart. So in some sense, I think ultimately, the kind of very long-term investment and kind of perhaps the most important investment to be made from, in particular, by civil society actors from weaker states, from let's say not from the great powers, is to keep pushing on their governments and on the international scene for actually preserving some sort of rules-based rather than only power-based order. However abstract that may sound, I mean, I think we have been taking for granted for quite some time that there is a rules-based order, and also in the trade regime, and then this is kind of, we can talk about bringing in our individual agendas and all that, but I also do think that the possibilities are that the things are going to get just so much worse for especially for weaker countries, even worse than now in terms of trade turmoil, and then the economic impact it's going to have on people are going to be massive. So I think this is something that is abstract, but at the same time perhaps like fundamental. And then in terms of the substantive agendas, I mean, there's quite a bit on the table. The question is whether something is going to be delivered, whether the organization is able to reach agreements on. So there are sustainability-related discussions are going to be pushed forward. There is a debate on the fishery subsidies agreement, for example. So in this agenda, there are several initiatives that have been ongoing for years, and that probably would benefit from participation or engagement from civil society. There's also other stuff that has been mentioned, like Martin mentioned, e-commerce, obviously. There's also this investment facilitation for development. This is going to be discussed there for sure, because the majority of countries of WTO members developed LDCs have signed agreement 2 years ago saying that we want a new agreement on facilitating investment in developing countries in particular. And yet a couple of countries are kind of blocking the inclusion of that agreement in the WTO rulebook. And so kind of creating this momentum and this pressure on, come on, like, most of us actually want this cooperation, and we shouldn't play politics too much, right? It shouldn't be too much of creating this environment in which we misuse or make use of, and in some views, misuse the consensus rule in the WTO. That may also be something to focus on. But admittedly, these are relatively more abstract things than perhaps the environmentally oriented negotiations, which are actually ongoing.
Thanks very much for giving us an idea of what's coming up next at the Yaoundé conference. And I think we're running a bit short of time, but I was wondering if we could move towards kind of some concluding remarks from all of the panelists. So firstly, perhaps Martin, on what the second ministerial conference means as it's being held on the African continent, and does the location matter? and what would a genuinely development-oriented outcome from Yaoundé look like?
Well, to me, I think really the location element is something that is more symbolic, because once the ministers get into that negotiating room, they really discuss the issues, and they have to report to I mean, to align with what their respective capitals want, and what they have managed, the consensus they have managed to build across their different coalitions. For instance, the LDC group, the African group, and the like. We also saw, for instance, during the Nairobi Ministerial Conference, that really it was more symbolic. There was a lot of interest that, yeah, with it being in Africa, we will get something, but really not much. And in any case, what has been agreed is really what ministers had presented. So for me, I don't see the location as really playing a very crucial role in the outcomes. In Yaoundé, I think I really also take in what Maka said. I don't see much coming out because of the issue of consensus. The reform proposals that we have in place, for instance, in the dispute settlement mechanism, still needs all members, to agree. And the US, as from towards the end of Obama time, really, they've just allowed the appellate body members terms to expire, and they've just not been part of the consensus for all the table to fill the vacancies. And the US has identified really issues that they feel the WTO dispute settlement bodies should take. They feel the issue of interpretation of the agreement. They feel it's really going beyond what members agreed, but then they are also not willing to negotiate and bring in alternatives. So I don't see the appellate body issue really being resolved in Yaoundé. The important issue for me would be if a special and differential treatment is really maintained, because there's been a lot of pushback on this. In a way, I see the challenge, because WTO members self-declare as developing countries. And so some of these developing countries have really also improved their economies a lot. And for instance, China has grown a lot, but it's still a developing countries. But because of the pressure now from developed country members, especially the US, they're willing now they're dropping that claim. But there are many other developing countries in the WTO that have really some level of economy and competitiveness that makes it hard for developed countries to agree. But these countries have also helped African countries in making SDT proposals that are strong. And so how to handle it is something that is really will be difficult, because I don't see a consensus coming there. The other issue I would also talk about is how to handle multilateral agreements. Mika talked of the investment facilitation for development agreement, and now we have also the e-commerce agreement. With the inflexibility or the difficulties for members to move and have an agreement at the WTO, a multilateral agreement, there is really this incentive for plurilateral agreements, but it needs consensus from other members. And especially India and South Africa, they have always not been part of that consensus to allow the investment facilitation agreement to be part of the WTO or to be annexed. And this is also a proposal that we see that countries have made that are parties to that agreement. This will be the similar case for the e-commerce agreement. It is interesting because a lot of the WTO from the GATT days, for the GATT 47 days, were really negotiated among a group of countries. And it's only when they reach at the WTO that other members join. So plurilateral agreements has really been pursued by countries, but it needs consensus for it to be put into the integrated into the WTO rulebook, and I don't see that consensus coming. So I also don't see the investment facilitation agreement as being legally integrated into the WTO law. So lastly, I would say, if for me a very good outcome in Yaoundé would be if multilateralism can be reinvigorated. They don't have to really agree on everything, but if there is an agreement on reinvigorating the multilateral system, having an agreement to address the underlying concerns of developing countries, and having an agreement to bridge the differences in position from developed country members with other powers like China, but and also to bridge that difference in approach to international trade that we are seeing increasingly from the US and the EU, that has been traditionally really been allies and pushing the multilateral trading system. If we can get that reinvigoration of multilateralism, that would be a good starting point from Yaoundé. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Yeah, so this is very interesting. Looking forward to what's coming up next in negotiations and at this meeting in Yaoundé, which is crucial. So we unfortunately don't have too much time left, but if there are any audience members with questions, please feel free to put it in the chat now and we can try and fit it in. Just before we finalize this webinar, Clara or Michael, do you have a final point you would like to make? Perhaps just something very brief, or something on how to improve global trade governance going forward, or where civil society should focus its strategies. Go ahead if you wish.
I'm just going to say one sentence, or two or three, actually. I think global trade has not been receiving enough of the attention from civil society and businesses. So the global trade regime itself, and I think in the long term, no matter how the current discussions in Yaoundé in a couple of weeks, and it's going to bring something probably, but ultimately in the long term, what is absolutely needed is for civil society actors and general non-state actors to take active interest in these matters in global economic governance at large, not only in trade, but right now, of course, trade is at the center of many political conflicts. So I would very much encourage people interested in how the global politics operate to take active interest in these matters.
Let me maybe add that I think what we see in trade is a little bit the past dependencies. It's become so difficult to update the rulebook with the consensus rule that if we had to reinvent the trading system, we would probably take some inspiration from climate, where we had the Kyoto Protocol expiring and hence creating a need for all countries to come together and negotiate a new deal, which then was successful with the Paris Agreement. And I think, if something like this would have been thought of in the WTO to have some clauses that actually expire and you have to update then and you're forced to it would probably be much easier to get an updated system of trade governance that is very much needed these days.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't see any additional questions in the chat at the moment, so I think we'll close the conversation for now. But thank you to all our panelists for participating today and for your expert comments on these issues, and also thank you to the participants for taking part. And well, this has been a great session, and we'll be sharing much more information on the Insured website and on YouTube very soon, and also regarding upcoming webinars in the series. So thanks again, and take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.